This is Jesse Berst of Smart Grid News, and today we're discussing some real-world lessons learned about data analytics. To help us with that, I want to bring up Raiford Smith. Now, you all know Duke Energy, one of the pioneering utilities, certainly one of the most adept at getting value out of emerging technology. And the guy who leads emerging technology at Duke is Raiford Smith. So, Raiford, thanks for being with us.
Great, thank you very much. What I thought I would start with today is just a quick overview about our analytics and for big data and our evolving strategy within emerging technology. Within Duke Energy, we have a bit of a different organization to be able to handle these sorts of questions. The first is that the emerging technology group here on the far left, our responsibility is really to develop new technologies. Everything from the initial business value and formulation of that use case to actually doing lab and field tests to ultimately come up with a strategy, a roadmap, and risk and opportunity identification. We have another group, Grid Modernization. Their job essentially is to deploy the technologies in mass. And then last but certainly not least, the transmission, distribution, and information technology organizations whose job really is to operate the system. That being said, today, Duke, as we look out here at all these different technologies and companies, when we say big data, it's just really a flood of them. There's so many of them, it's really hard to figure out, for us at least, what we should be doing, which technologies and which companies that we really ought to be partnered with. And so with that in mind, we set about a path to try and figure out that strategy from an emerging technology perspective. So just typically what happens in utilities is that really we're asking questions about what we are supposed to be doing, which typically is the operational improvement or earnings enhancement or some sort of business transformation. And that with that, we then try and ask ourselves how we should be doing that. And typically that involves really the following steps, which is ingesting data by some methodology, storing it, analyzing it, and then turning it into some sort of intelligence. And then the people that typically ask us that, obviously are the major customers within our company: generation, transmission, distribution, the customer, and then maybe other corporate functions. Unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of times these, both the what's and the how's, they're really done in a very siloed fashion. Really, they involve a lot of very proprietary solutions and a lot of middleware that's extremely costly and very complicated for us to maintain. And so our challenge is, how do we break out of this siloed and proprietary perspective and really step back and think of analytics for the entire company and how that data and those systems really ought to be best used. So today our analytics framework is a very siloed and vertical structure, meaning we get data from systems and then they go through their own security, their own data collection methodology, their own storage, and then ultimately they may or may not be translated into some form of common language and contextualized so that we can visualize it, discover what's being used, and turning it into some form of business intelligence. That is a process that is very brittle. As the company comes up with a new use case, essentially what we see is that we have to start all over again and build in yet another set of security, data collection, storage, and then redo much of this systems and equipment. And that just doesn't provide the flexibility and the capability or the speed to necessarily explore the data and to take advantage of it. So essentially what we're trying to do is turn that model on its head and essentially at the edge of our network, begin the translation from any device that we may receive into a common language using a field message bus. Once we have that common language, we use SIM to contextualize all the data so that now, no matter where the analytics may reside, whether they are in the central office, whether they're at the substation, or whether they're at the edge, now anything can publish or subscribe to that model without having to worry about it being too brittle or unable or too expensive to flexibly adjust to some new use case or some different utilization of data that we hadn't previously envisioned. We also store the data both in a structured format and an unstructured format, and I'll touch on that briefly, why we do that. And then, of course, we use the visualization, discovery process, and business intelligence to, in turn, figure out not just what should we be doing with that data, but also to figure out where we should put it so that it is most efficient. And then we overlay the entire process with security as a way to ensure that data, as soon as it touches our network, that we do it in a secure and safe fashion. So that being said, we went out and we started to survey our vendors, and we really went out and asked a wide variety of them to go help us start to tackle this problem and come up with a strategy. And what we see is certainly a lot of different categories of use cases and vendors that are in that space doing work in those areas. And it seemed to be, of course, a very target-rich environment. So, of course, we wanted to know what we should really narrow down on. As we did that, we gave our vendors essentially a broad spectrum of data that was really a cross-functional area of a lot of what we have today, but from a volumetric perspective, most of the data that we had came from our AMI systems. Of course, we asked the question, were we skewing our data, or the skewing of the availability, was that leading us to skew which use cases we really ought to be tracking down for value? So we just did some simple number crunching here. If you went and looked at the FERC Form 1 data for not only our company but also our industry, what you would see is that from a spending perspective, a cost perspective, that a majority of the spending comes from generation and not so much from transmission, distribution, or customer. It's not to say that you would ignore those areas, but it would seem that if you could find a target-rich area that you might want to focus on, generation might be the richest area. So we formed this data mining and analytics initiative, and really that was this, how do we start to come up with this analytics strategy? And we went out and we asked 22 different vendors to participate, and we provided them 1 week of comprehensive data from across all our different systems and all our different devices. We asked them for use cases to prime the pump and figure out, we asked them, tell us what you think you can make of this data. And with that helps us get an idea of what use cases we could go chase down, what they were worth, what sort of assets we should put in place to take advantage of that, and then what the relative value and prioritization of those systems were in the underlying IT information technology. So with that, we invited a whole host of these, and we also created an internal stakeholder group across everything from customer analytics, emerging technology, and a variety of other stakeholders. And we asked a lot of vendors to come back to give us results, and you can see here a variety of them from Itron, Interval Analytics, SAS, you name it, pretty much the big hitters. It then gave us a whole variety of new and existing ideas for what we could do from this process from analytics. With that, we noticed the vendors were using a whole host of different tools, and so part of this learning opportunity for us was to figure out not only what they were using, but why they were using it and what the benefits that could be achieved by using them were. As we were doing that, we also asked them to give us these use cases as well as to give us some sort of estimation of what the value we thought could be achieved by pursuing that use case. And what we tried to do is frame those answers relative to Duke Energy's profile in terms of being a $45 billion company. What generally does it look like for us in terms of opportunities? And what we saw here was kind of an interesting set of results. What you see here is the results of all the different vendors' responses. The item highlighted in red are the meter analytics. This is the one that vendors were most familiar with, but if you notice, the value score was kind of in the middle of the pack. It wasn't at the very top, nor was it at the very bottom, but kind of in the middle of the road. Unusually, security was actually at the very top of the pack, with having the highest value score and about the tightest standard deviation. So we saw kind of some interesting results there. Also, if you look at the bottom, in other words, some of the least valuable areas, we saw that distributed generation, so that's management of renewables and battery storage and advanced demand response, had some of the lowest values. And we were very puzzled by that result. We actually expected those to be flip-flopped and meter analytics to be a bit higher. And so with that led us to other questions.